If you enjoy the story, give it a like and feel free to leave a comment. Also, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon to be the first to hear new cryptid tales. I'm always looking for stories to share, so if you've had your own encounter with the unknown, send me an email at cryptidtalesmel@gmail.com.
This took place in October of 1987. Myself and a friend headed out for a camping trip just outside of the old Kingsbury Ordnance Plant. We chose a spot about 1.5 miles of Hupp Road, the main road that goes in and out of the abandoned KOP grounds. The KOP was permanently shut down in 1959, and the 13,000 acres had become taken over by nature, with the tattered remains of the buildings scattered about the property. Needless to say, it had its own creepy atmosphere. We began setting up camp as the sun started to drop below the horizon. By the time we had finished, my friend had to head back to his house to wait for the arrival of another friend that would be joining us on our camping trip after he got off work. I stayed behind to get the campfire going. I wasn't real worried about being left out there alone at the time, but shortly after my friend left, I started second-guessing my decision to stay at camp. It was now dusk, and I was completely alone. I started hearing a rustling coming from the woods nearby. I thought to myself that it was probably just a deer, trying to convince myself mostly, but hanging on the thought of the probably. About 10 short minutes later, I heard the sounds again, this time louder and closer than the time before. I yelled out, hoping that it would scare off whatever woodland creature was out there rustling around and settle my nerves a bit. All fell quiet for the next several minutes. The short-lasting silence was interrupted all too quickly by what sounded like something grunting, coming from the same location I had heard the rustling. I was completely rattled by this and yelled out again, commanding the hidden visitor to knock it off. I even picked up a large stick and tried bluffing that I had a gun. I felt silly, not even knowing who or what I was trying to intimidate, but it didn't keep me from trying to give the performance of my life. The noises stopped once again. I calmed down a bit as the silence of the woods started to relax me again, and I turned my attention back to the campfire. No sooner had I done so than a loud thump sounded off just to the right of me, causing my heart to leap up into my throat. I jerked my head towards the sound and saw a large tree stump had landed just a few feet away from me. I jumped up and faced the woods, yelling at whoever had thrown the stump to knock it off or I'd shoot, still bluffing that I had a gun with me. As soon as the words had left my mouth, I saw a large log sailing through the air towards me, crashing down to the ground just to my left. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling down. I took off running down the trail that led back to the road. I had covered probably 100 yards or so when I began hearing the sound of something running along the old railroad tracks that paralleled the trail just a few yards away. I could hear the rocks crunching and scattering with each footfall. The sound of the steps were much farther apart than the sound of my own feet hitting the ground. I continued running and continued hearing whatever it was running right along with me. This went on for several seconds before suddenly coming to an abrupt halt. But I didn't stop. I just kept running for maybe another 25 or 30 yards before stopping myself, now completely out of breath. The sky was now dark and overcast. I frantically looked around, trying to see whatever was following me, but it was too dark and all I could see was trees. I took off in a fast walk and continued my trek to the main road. The trail sloped downwards into an old, dried-up creek bed for about 30 feet before it returned back to level ground. There, in the middle of the trail, is where I saw the creature. I know what I saw, and I knew it wasn't a human. It looked large, larger than a man, and was covered in what looked like shaggy hair. It was too dark to really make out any details other than that, and that it was standing on 2 legs and had long arms hanging down at its sides. As soon as I looked up and saw it, it quickly turned and stepped back off into the cover of the woods. It's really mostly a blur of scattered thoughts after that point. I made it back to the main road and eventually got back to my friend's house. The whole way there, I held on to the thought that maybe it was all just an elaborate prank. Maybe my friends had orchestrated the entire thing and would be waiting for me to show up at the house. When I finally arrived, I found my friend sitting on his couch with his shoes off, still waiting for our other friend to get there. I still questioned if he had been there the whole time, not saying what had happened, but seeing if he would own up to it. His mother overheard me and assured me that he had been there the entire time, and asked me what happened with a look of concern on her face. I didn't respond and just sat down in silence. When our other friend finally arrived, we all 3 went back to the campsite. I reluctantly went back, but found courage in the thought that once we got back to camp, they would come clean and admit to having been behind the entire thing, even if his mother had backed his story. When the camp came into view, I could tell by the looks on their faces that they had nothing to do with it. The stump and log were still laying where they had been. The fire was barely glowing, with a steady stream of smoke rising up into the sky. The tent we had set up earlier was torn down and ripped into several large pieces and strewn about. They both turned and looked at me, but I stood there in silence, not making eye contact with either one. We put out what was left of the fire and gathered up the few belongings we had and made our way back to the car. I'm not sure of what it was exactly that I saw, but I am certain of what I experienced. Still, to this day, I won't go back there. I returned only one time and drove through the abandoned plant. Even then, it felt like the creature was watching me from the woods.